Hi, Aaron.
Hi.
How you doing today?
Pretty good. How about you?
I'm not doing too bad. It's a nice day here in Washington, D.C. I've been suffering from a little bit of some kind of virus, so if I sound froggy later on, it's because my vocal cords are fragile. But I'm Will Wilkinson here at the Cato Institute, and Aaron, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Aaron Swartz. I've done a couple things, I guess the latest of which I co-founded a startup called Reddit.com and a new site called Open Library, and my latest project is a site called Watchdog.net, which presumably we'll be talking about all three of those later in the show.
Yeah, well, let's talk about them. I mean, now, Aaron, I understand you're not an elderly gentleman.
Not yet.
Not yet. How old are you?
I'm 21. You're
21. So, well, you might be the first guest on Free Will that I've had that I guess could have been my child had I been an extremely sexually active teen. But so that's the first. But you're 21, but you've been in the computer business for some time now. So how did you get your start?
I guess the first big thing I did was I was home one summer and I was reading lots of different news sites, and I got kind of fed up having to visit a whole bunch of sites, just to see what the latest news was during the day. Mm-hmm. So I started writing software to try and pull stuff from different sites, and that ended up turning into RSS 1.0, which now a lot of people use to pull news from various sites. And that was when I was 13.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. That's quite useful. And you are, I think, best known as one of the co-founders of Reddit. Tell us how Reddit got started and how you got involved, for starters.
Sure. Reddit got started as part of a project called Y Combinator, which is sort of a seed funding company in Boston. And basically what they try and do is find, smart young programmers who, are kind of don't want to work for a day job but are capable of building something themselves, mm-hmm. and give them a little bit of money to just get started, to find an apartment, buy a couple computers or a server or something, and just sit over the summer or over the winter for mm-hmm. a couple months and see if they can build something. And if you build something interesting, then they start introducing you to venture capitalists and other investors and try and get it off the ground as a startup.
I mean, they really give you a very small amount of money to begin with. It's not that impressive.
Yeah, it's $6,000 a person.
$6,000 a person, yeah. So they're making these sort of micro investments in people who might be able to do something.
Yeah, exactly. The idea is just basically enough to live off of for the summer to see if you can build something mm-hmm. during that time. So it's very low risk for them, but if it works, they give you a lot of education and a lot of opportunity and support in getting you connected and turning it into a real company.
Mm-hmm. Well, so what did you do that summer?
So I started working on a project called Infogami, which was going to be kind of a way for people to make websites really easily. Mm-hmm. And at the end of the summer, I became really close friends with these two other people who started working on what was, called Reddit then. And we decided, to merge the projects and pursue both of them together, just, because we liked each other and thought that they were complementary. Mm-hmm. Infogami was a way for people to publish stuff on the web, and Reddit was a way for people to find it. And as we started working together, and, the first thing we did was we rewrote Reddit, and after we did that, we noticed it started really taking off, and so we never really got time to go back and work on Infogami.
Yeah.
So we, ended up focusing on Reddit, which grew and grew at 4 times while I was there.
Yeah, so
until it eventually got bought by Condé Nast.
Uh-huh. Yeah, we'll talk about what happened after they got bought in a second. I'm sure almost all the Blogging Heads viewers will have used Reddit at some point, but in case there are a few who haven't, just explain what the idea is behind Reddit and websites like it.
Yeah, the idea was basically there's lots of interesting things out in the internet, lots of new things every day, and what you really want is kind of a custom selection of the most interesting of them, so that you don't have to dig through dozens of sites, many of which you don't even know about. Mm-hmm. And so, one way to do this is you have some blogger who sits and reads lots of different sites and selects the finest of them. But, nobody can read every site on the internet, and, you don't always want the tastes of one particular person.
Yeah.
And so what we decided to do was try and build something where it was much more democratic. People could, anybody could submit a story to the site, and then everybody else would vote on it. Mm-hmm. And the stories that got the highest number of votes kind of rose to the top, and people could read that selection of the news every day.
Mm-hmm. Well, Reddit's had, a great deal of success. It's been extremely popular. In my experience of Reddit, I mean, I still go to it on a regular basis, and I still find things that I don't think I otherwise would have found. But for a while there, basically, I felt like all I was getting were stories about Ron Paul and links to LOLcats. Is this sort of a self? That there's a kind of winner's curse with these sort of self-edited sites where the more popular they get, the more the audience starts to tilt towards lowest common denominator sort of things, such that the site is there's a kind of sweet spot where it's gotten pretty popular, so it's got enough of a pool of people that it's aggregating from, it's getting a lot of contributions, and it can winnow out the really interesting things among a fairly large pool, but it hasn't gotten so popular that you're getting kind of like mindless dreck. Is there a kind of a problem in kind of identifying the sweet spot in terms of the size of the audience and things like that?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I should say that I don't work at Reddit anymore, so I'm just speaking on behalf of myself.
Yeah.
But, yeah, I mean, we definitely noticed that as Reddit, that it kind of, it had this kind of arc shape where it went up and things were really interesting for a while, and there was a nice range of stories, and then, things started going down, and more and more, interesting photos of rainbows or cats or things about, Ron Paul or Dennis Kucinich or stuff.
A cat sitting on Ron Paul, sliding down a rainbow,
Yeah, it's guaranteed number one.
Yeah. Phenomenal. In fact, I would like to see that picture right now. Yeah.
And so, that was something I was worried about while I was there, and we experimented with various ways to kind of get around that, but, it was never really a high priority because the, surprising thing, to me at least, was that the site just kept growing. The more Ron Paul stories came up, the more traffic we had, and so there wasn't a lot of incentive to start tweaking things and changing it, to be more interesting and more fair, because, people seemed to like what was there already.
Yeah.
But, if I had stayed on and actually gotten to tackle that problem, some things we were thinking about trying were, collaborative filtering so that it kind of recognized your own particular interests and tried to find stories from other people like you instead of just the lowest common denominator. There were also, simple algorithmic changes. Like right now, the reason stories about cats go to the top is because they're really quick to read. So anyone who clicks on the cat, can see it in like half a second and immediately hit the back button and vote it up. Whereas if you click and you get, a 5-page article from the New Yorker, you're like, oh, I don't really have time to read this now, and so you'd end up not voting on it.
Right.
And so the cat stories always dominate the New Yorker stories just because more people get a chance to vote on it. Mm-hmm. And so if instead, of just taking the absolute number of votes, you started using more fancy metrics to get the relative number of votes or the range of people who like the story or things like that. Mm-hmm. I think there's some tweaks you could have done to make the site a little more interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I found like even if you had something that was, keeping track of what you're voting up, I mean, like I'm kind of amazed by how good some of these music sites are, like Last.fm or Pandora are at figuring out what I want to listen to. It starts out a little bit spotty, but if you just keep doing the ratings, voting just up or down on a particular song, it starts knowing, who you are pretty quickly, so that kind of stuff can work.
Yeah, I think it'd be really great if someone was able to try that for news, just like even like Delicious, being able to filter Delicious from other people who's bookmarked the same stories I bookmarked would be really interesting.
Yeah. Well, that would be great. Because what I really want is just, I think that's kind of the ideal, that you want your... Because already I've gotten to the point where I use Google Reader to manage my RSS feeds, and I've already gotten to the point where I have way too many feeds.
Yeah.
And so but there's a lot of things that I want to keep track of. It's just that a lot of the blogs that I'm following, or a lot of the news sources that I'm following, 30% maybe of what's published there is something that I'm really interested in. And so I kind of wish that it would just give me the 30% I was interested in, rather than having to wade through all this other stuff from this site that I just don't want. So I want the smart reader that kind of pre-edits and knows what I'm going to read.
Yeah, exactly. One of the things we were thinking about along those lines was using backlinks. If you had an RSS reader, it could see what other feeds link to and kind of promote those stories first, because those tend to be the interesting parts of the blog as opposed to the posts about cats, which generally don't get many links from other blogs.
Yeah. So let's go back to the story of Reddit. So you're there for how long?
I guess it was there for 18 months or so, almost 2 years.
Almost 2 years. How long in was it that when it got bought by Condé Nast?
Yeah, it got bought about then. I was only at Condé Nast for a couple of months.
Yeah, so you were there so why did you end up leaving?
So it's kind of a funny story. I wasn't super thrilled about working at Condé Nast, and because it was quite a change. We had been working out of our apartment. It was just kind of fun and relaxing, and you'd wake up and wander down the hall and, talk to people.
Yeah.
And at Condé Nast, they moved us all out to San Francisco, and, we didn't have time to find a place, so I was sleeping in a friend's closet, and every morning I had to get up and take the bus to, this gray building downtown and work in this officeplex. And I wasn't really enjoying it, and I took off for Christmas break and went to Berlin with some friends of mine, one of whom was actually a reporter for Wired, which was the division of Condé Nast that put us under. And we went to a conference, and she ended up reporting on the conference for Wired and taking a photo of me, which ended up on the Wired front page. And I joked, the first time my bosses are going to find out where I am is when they open up their browsers and read the front page of their own website. And apparently they weren't too amused, because when I got back on Monday morning, they fired me.
Just because, where were you supposed to be somewhere in particular?
Not really. I mean, it was Christmas break. I guess I was probably supposed to be at the office at some point, but well, I wasn't really going to dig into it, because I was pretty happy to be released from my contract with Condé Nast.
Yeah.
I wasn't going to put up a fight.
So, where did you go directly after that? I mean, because that doesn't sound very pleasant to me. I wouldn't want to, have to work. I mean, especially if you're used to a kind of entrepreneurial lifestyle and you're kind of doing it by yourself, and then all of a sudden you're in the, officeplex, as you say.
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, I mean, I think they could see I wasn't happy there, and I guess they weren't really happy with me dragging everybody down with my unhappiness.
So where did you go after that?
So I went back to my closet for a while and, sat and read some books for a week and rested up. And, then I pretty quickly got a call from a fellow named Brewster Kale, who, runs an organization called the Internet Archive. And probably viewers know them for running the site, archive.org, which, lets you see old versions of web pages, but they also keep copies of old LPs, they digitize old movies, they, record every television show in a whole bunch of different countries, and now the big thing they're focused on is scanning old books and putting them online. And, he called me up and said he was thinking about building a site that would try and create a big database of every book ever published, in a wiki, so that people could contribute information and read about them and edit them and, find interesting books, and also, find the books that they had scanned and kind of highlight those for people. And that was something I'd been thinking about for a while. I'd worked on it a little bit before joining Reddit, just as a side project, and so, the idea that they were willing to fund it and, actually built it was really exciting. And so I ended up joining them, and we, hired a couple people to work on it, and ended up building this site, which you can now see at openlibrary.org.
Openlibrary.org. So for every book that's... The goal is to have a page for every book that's ever been published, and the users then can edit those pages, and, you can list all the characters in the book, or give a plot summary. Is that the idea, to be able to...
Yeah, that's right. So, basically... It came out of me noticing that there were all these interesting old books at the library that just, I would never have heard about because they don't have any pages on the internet. Unless it's a book that's currently in print, the publisher doesn't care about it anymore. Amazon doesn't really have a page about it because they don't sell it. And, libraries have these really terrible websites so that nobody can find them on Google. And so I thought it would be really great to have a website where you could, find these interesting old books that weren't really getting enough attention and, let the people who cared about them build these pages about them.
So how does this relate?
People who care about obscure subjects build pages on Wikipedia.
Yeah. So how does this relate to the sort of the project of digitizing all of those books? So the ostensible goal of sort of Google Books is to digitize all the books that have ever been published, and there's another the archives or the organization that you're working with is doing similar things. Is the idea is to be able to have these pages kind of tie in with the online text of these books, so that there's because I'm just imagining this sort of old-fashioned idea I remember from. So, like in the early 90s, I was part of some email list where we were doing a work of, collaborative hyperlinked fiction or something like that. Mm-hmm. And this is, this was, I don't know, 1993 or something like that. And most of the sort of internet was more of a sort of an idea than a reality. And within that group, there was a very strong idea about like sort of all texts being very densely hyperlinked, so that there would be a path from any random book to any other random book through some sort of network of links if you followed them. And somehow this kind of makes me think of that. So if you have a book that's been scanned in and archived from Google Books or whatever, but you can always go from that book to the page about that book, and then the page about that book is going to tell you about other books that the author wrote and similar books. And you should be able to, like, these sources of information ought to just, have these pathways to all these other sources of information.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think, one of the things that's really exciting about it is it really, kind of highlights these links between books, which, are hard to find right now on the web. So if you read an interesting book, but, you're kind of unsure whether it's true or not, it'd be really great to have a link from that to a book that rebuts it, or an article that, critiques it or points out where it went wrong. Or, have someone say, well, this is a pretty good book, but this is a much better version of that, or this is a sequel of that, or those sorts of things, which just haven't been captured right now. And so one of the things we're really excited about is providing a place for people to share that kind of information.
I think that would be amazing with that if you have this huge source of texts that are freely available to the public because they're being scanned in by these various projects, and a website like Open Library that sort of catalogs all this information about these books. It would be really, really nice to have something like, I keep thinking about these recommendation engine kind of ideas. So I do find Amazon's recommendation engine really, really useful. It knows the kind of books that I would like to read. But of course, if we're going to have all of these free books, right? I don't the way Amazon knows is because I've got a pattern of consumption. But if there's all these books out there for free, how does Google Books know what books that I really liked once I looked at them, or how does Project Gutenberg know which classics I really liked? So it'd be great to have some way of being able to put in information about your preferences over these kinds of old, obscure books and books that are freely available, and then have it recommend other books to you, because there's really very little way of finding them.
Yeah, no, that's one of the things that frustrates me is that, you only come across these old books like when some classicist happens to write a magazine article you're reading. It's really hard to find them again. So that's a great point, is maybe doing some collaborative filtering based on people. Maybe we could have like a Reddit for books where people could vote them up or down, or, use the review data people contribute to recommend books to them.
Yeah, because I've got this kind of fantasy about there being like the perfect book of political philosophy that some obscure person wrote that is in some, small Midwestern liberal arts college library that's just sitting there moldering, and then someday someone will scan that in and something that's really precious will have been preserved, and maybe someone will discover how important it is. Because there's got to be things that are important, that are good to read, that we've just forgotten about.
Oh yeah, and it'd be great to recover those and just make them available to people online.
So your current project is working on a wiki. Do you say wiki or wiki?
It's a wiki.
Wiki. It's like one of those tomato kind of words.
Yeah.
Yeah. You perusing your website, you had a couple nice essays on Wikipedia, or Wikipedia, however you'd like to say it. Especially the one that I found most interesting was your essay on who writes Wikipedia. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so the story there is basically Jimbo Wales, the kind of spokesperson for Wikipedia, had been going around for a while giving these talks on Wikipedia, explaining to people how it got built. And he said, the way it got built was basically he and 500 of his friends, these people who kind of all knew each other and all went to Wikipedia conferences together and, hung out in bars and things. They had basically sat down and written the bulk of the site, and he had some statistics which he said showed this, that 80% of the edits or something were done by this group of 500. So really, the vast majority of the content was really by him and his friends. And yeah, lots of other people came to the site and made little changes here and there, and occasionally they were useful, but on the whole they weren't that important, and they were mostly spam and vandalism and stuff. And really it was the 500 people who were, the big deal, and so most of what he did was spend his time making those 500 people happy so that they kept contributing to the site. And
mm-hmm.
people seem kind of skeptical, but, he had statistics and, he clearly really believed it, and so most people seem to buy it.
Yeah, I saw him give this talk at one point, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I saw him when he came to Stanford and gave the talk, and I just didn't sit well with me. Like, if you think about it for a second, it doesn't really make sense that 500 people could write 1 million encyclopedia articles in 4 years.
Right.
Those must be some really special 500 people, just to even know something about, 1 million different topics.
Right.
So,
know something about all the Pokemon characters and the, atomic weight of, aluminum.
Right, and every 1920s politician in Britain, and... wow, those people...
It's just, he found all and only, Jeopardy Grand Champion winners.
Yeah, it seemed weird to me, so I decided to dig into the statistics a little more. And what he had been doing is counting edits, right? He'd been counting every time someone had hit the save button.
Yeah.
And what I tried to do was redo the study counting characters every time someone had typed a key
mm-hmm.
that made it into the final version of the page. And what I found was that if you just looked at keystrokes instead of edits, the numbers were radically different. The vast majority of articles were written by people who didn't even bother to create an account,
mm-hmm.
or if they did create an account, they used it once or twice and then never made another edit again.
Mm-hmm.
It was all these people who had made under 5 edits or so. They contributed the vast majority of the content. And so basically, when you looked at these pictures of these pages by who wrote them, it was people adding a couple words or a sentence here or there, and pretty soon all of these words and sentences added up to create these full long articles you see on Wikipedia today. So it was really more this model of millions of ants rather than the gang of 500 who had written Wikipedia. And I thought that was really important, for running Wikipedia, because it meant instead of Jimbo Wales spending his time making this group of 500 people happy, what he should really do is make it easier for the site to be used by these millions of people, these people just who want to add a sentence here or there. Make it super simple for them to add things, and that's what will help Wikipedia grow.
Yeah, I think as you mentioned in your essay, part of the rhetorical point, it seems, for Jimmy was that if you could say, hey, look, a massive proportion of the edits are made by a small number of people, you can kind of reassure people that it's not just this, anarchic hodgepodge.
Right.
But as you're saying, that those people, and it's true that there are a small minority of people who make the vast majority of edits. Most of those edits these are the people who, like the worker ants of Wikipedia, who clean things up. They move things around. They put everything into this standardized format for, this is a biography. The biographies should have this format. But they're not actually writing the content. So there's kind of like a form-content distinction in how people are contributing.
Yeah, exactly. I think of them, kind of the way the editors of an encyclopedia, a traditional encyclopedia, would work. Mm-hmm. If you look at something like Encyclopedia Britannica, you have thousands of experts who write up these articles and then send them into the Encyclopedia Britannica, and then they have this small core staff which goes and edits them and, makes sure all the punctuation is right and, copy edits them and fact checks some things and puts them into the right format and compiles this encyclopedia out of all these individual articles. Yeah. I think the Gang of 500 works kind of the same way.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I fit your pattern. I mean, I've made a number of Wikipedia entries, and but I don't spend that much time at it. But the ones that I did spend some, I wrote the entire entry for a number of at the time when it was starting. I've mentioned this before, so I won't bore my repeat listeners. But I was a part of the original Newpedia project. I've known Jimmy Wales and Larry Sanger for a number of years before they started this, and I was part of the philosophy group in Newpedia, and as they moved over to Wikipedia, I wrote a few of the philosophy entries. So I think I've got like the first edit in like egalitarianism or something like that, and I forget there's a couple of other. Perceptual realism, or I don't know which ones, but there's a number of. But my contributions were, you just write the whole entry, basically, and then and over the years, so some of these are 5-6 years old now, more than that. You can kind of see like traces of what you'd originally written, but it's mostly get. And the interesting thing, actually, the thing that I found most interesting is that I actually have, or maybe I was thinking the consequentialism. Entry, which I have, somewhat non-conventional ideas about how to think about the notion of consequentialism, and so but I was the first guy to write the entry, and I sort of created the logical structure for the entry, and despite the fact that I have slightly off-center views relative to the philosophical mainstream, the way I organized it has kind of persisted, even though a lot of the content has changed. So there's this interesting. That there's this like first mover effects in Wikipedia where the person who structures the entry in the first instance tends to have a lasting effect on it, even if everything gets changed over time.
That's an interesting point. Because I think part of it is, I've tried to a couple articles making some, radical changes and reorganizing things, and the editors, the Gang of 500 kind of comes in and says, no, this is too radical, we're going to revert it back to the way it was.
Yeah. So, but if you were the guy who wrote it originally,
right?
Then somehow everybody who makes changes after that has to justify the deviation from the original plan.
Yeah, that's an interesting point.
Yeah, and so that was something that I thought about when thinking about wikis. Is how if somebody's going to start a new project and you want to have a big say in it, you should get a gang of your sort of ideologically motivated friends to write all the entries that you're interested in first, and make the other side have to justify their attempt to frame it in a different way. Because in the end, the neutral point of view ideal is still nothing is ever completely neutral. It is an ideal, but slightly different ways of framing the same issue can definitely sort of bias the way people look at it. So.
Right. So since you and Jimmy Wales' friends were all from the Ayn Rand objectivist mailing list, would you say Wikipedia now has this objectivist bias?
Well, I wouldn't, because it's actually kind of interesting because really early on, because a bunch of objectivists started it, and the most well-fleshed out parts of Wikipedia early on were the philosophy entries, because Larry Sanger basically downloaded all of his lecture notes from Ohio State into it. That I think that still there are some traces of that in there, but I think the ideology of the sort of median Wikipedia power user is quite a bit more liberal, or however you want to carve up the ideological space. I think my sense is that Wikipedia, to the extent that it has a slant, it slants a little bit left relative to sort of American popular public opinion, right. But that's just what you'd expect given the sort of the educational attainment of the level of the people who are doing it. But you do see traces of this sort of in the 90s, the internet was like a really quite libertarian place in a way that it's not now. For some reason or another, a lot of the early adopters who were extremely enthusiastic about the internet also had a kind of libertarianish politics, and it seemed sort of wildly disproportionate early on in the internet. And now, as more and more of the general population starts to use it, I think the disproportionate sort of libertarian bias in tone of a lot of online projects has dwindled almost to nothing. But I think you still see it. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I spent some of the 90s with the cypherpunks, right? And I think there was kind of this strong techno-utopian strain among libertarians that basically, technology and the internet in particular would kind of lead them to this anarcho-capitalist utopia that they'd always been dreaming of, where, people could use anonymous digital cash and encryption to kind of evade any kind of government regulation. And so basically the state would just wither away because it would be impossible to stop people from going underground and using, digital electronic markets and encryption to do whatever it was they wanted. And I think, part of it is that more people ended up using the internet, and so those people got diluted. But part of it was also, I think a lot of those dreams just kind of failed, digital cash has gone nowhere, basically. Only a handful of really obsessive people ended up using encryption on a daily basis for their email. A lot of these kind of cyber utopian dreams went away. The biggest success was probably peer-to-peer file sharing, but even like Napster ended up getting shut down. Now, a couple people use Kazan, Tele, and some of these other networks, but it's not, as much of a mainstream fundamental phenomenon as they were hoping for. I think the state kind of won this battle in a way they weren't expecting.
Yeah. What's the guy's name? The guy who founded PayPal, is it Peter Thiel or something like that?
Peter Thiel, yeah.
Yeah, the guy who founded PayPal. He's a committed libertarian, and that was his idea. He was like, I wanted to have some form of digital cash that would sort of evade the tax-scrubbing hands of the IRS, right?
Right. That was now look, it's owned by eBay, and they crack down on anybody using it for, like, even pornography or something, right? Because they want to keep this squeaky clean public company image.
Yeah, so do you think that a lot of those ideas were just technologically infeasible all along, and that this was just a way of projecting a certain kind of utopian hope onto a new technology, or?
I don't think they were wrong about the technology. I think they were wrong about, kind of the sociology of the problem. Mm-hmm. Basically, a lot of, the vast majority of Americans did not want to live underground, right? They wanted to, use their credit cards and, go to real places and buy things over the internet from trusted vendors, secure sites. They wanted to live in the mainstream culture, and the state, even if it couldn't regulate all the particular things that were going on the internet, still has a lot of power to regulate mainstream culture. They regulate publicly traded corporations. They regulate what's on TV, and they regulate these sort of big public things. And for people to get around that, you really have to live your entire life anonymous and underground, and do all these kind of evasive maneuvers that the average person just really isn't interested in doing.
Yeah. So I completely agree with that analysis. I'm a professional libertarian, and I've never been interested in, just because it's a hassle, I've never been interested in, like, doing transactions with e-gold or encrypting all my emails with PGP or what. That when I see people who do it, it seems more like if somebody's interested in encrypting their personal communications, it almost seems more like an ideological signal. Right, it's like it's like what people are doing when they're driving hybrid cars. They're just trying to signal to you a certain kind of commitment to a particular ideology, because it doesn't really have any effect unless it's coordinated, and you don't get enough people to coordinate on this new norm unless the cost of doing it is a lot lower than it is, and so I was never interested in I'm sure, like, I have some, like, I used PGP for like a week and a half or something like that, and then stopped.
Yeah, same here. I mean, it's just not worth the hassle of doing it every day. You know, at the end of the day, you realize, like, I don't care that much about keeping my emails private. It's not worth it.
Yeah, I mean, and that's a general point too about that. I actually find that there's some dispute among libertarian types that I know about, surveillance or about databases. Like I don't really care that my supermarket is keeping track of everything that I buy. I'm not that closed circuit TV surveillance cameras on streets don't really bother me that much. And so I've never been that sort of privacy obsessed. But a lot of people really, really are privacy obsessed, and it because it seems like one of those things where, I don't know. I mean, what do you think it's really? Because I don't want people invading my privacy, but at the same time, when my actions are just an infinitesimal part of a huge collection of data, I feel like that kind of anonymity is pretty close to privacy.
Yeah, I'm more of an anarcho-socialist than an anarcho-capitalist. Mm-hmm. So I tend to think, the way if we're going to succeed with privacy, it's not going to be because every individual person decides to encrypt their communications and, use anonymous cache, but more because we're, as a society, will come together and pass regulations that will force corporations to, not keep certain types of data or keep it private or do things like that. And I think, I do worry about privacy, not, and I guess it's not because of any particular thing that's happened to me, but just because I sort of worry about this, this encroaching database state where, I have these customized mailers that come to my house and, these political people who knock on my door and already know what kind of food I eat and, what kind of politicians that I tend to vote for. And it's just, it feels kind of creepy in some weird guttural sense to have these other people knowing so much about you. Even if the average person isn't going to get abused, I think there's a real potential for abuse, not only through things like identity theft, but also just, by being able to beat up on people who have certain kinds of politics and, like people who support gay rights organizations in neighborhoods where, being gay isn't very popular. I think there's a real danger that people's secrets and stuff will end up getting out, whether through these leaks of these corporations or otherwise, and people will get punished for having deviant beliefs or for doing strange things.
Yeah, I think I agree. But it seems like, I can't think of a principle. Like, I don't know if it worries me in principle if people know a lot about me. Like, there's a famous, I'm recalling, I forget who made this little online video. It's about some guy who calls to get a pizza, and the pizza delivery person knows everything.
ACLU, I think, made this. Yeah.
Yeah. And there are some pieces of data that the pizza place has on this guy that evidently they shouldn't have, and it would make me feel uncomfortable. I don't need them knowing what my body mass index is or anything like that. But the thing is, the question isn't so much. So there's the question of privacy and anonymity versus the question of abuse, and I think you're right that there's a certain extent to which just having information easily available tempts the abuse, but it's really the abuse that I'm worried about, not the availability of the information.
Yeah, I've had to deal with this myself because I kind of struggle to reconcile, my support for privacy generally with the fact that I'm kind of a public person. I write stuff on my blog about my health, about, how I feel about my job, about all sorts of kinds of things that, would traditionally be considered fairly private information. And what I realized was, it's not so much that the information is out there, it's the context the information gets used in. Mm-hmm. I don't mind if there are a couple of strangers out there who, are reading about my life and corresponding with me about it. But I do mind, if like the pizza guy or the guy at the coffee shop suddenly in the middle of my normal transaction of buying coffee starts, asking about like my health conditions, right? Yeah. It just feels really awkward to have those boundaries breached. And so I think it's more of a, a context and a comfort thing than it is about the actual data per se.
Yeah, so there's an interesting question then. I think that's exactly right, that you want people to know certain things about you in the right context. And it's actually better, so if I have my sort of Google Health profile that has all of my medical information in it, and if I could sort of forward that to my new doctor before I ever show up at the office, I'm glad that my doctor knows my entire medical history and everything, all the drugs that I've been taking before I get there, right? It's great. He's the guy, that's the context in which I want that information shared. I don't want the pizza guy to have that information. So the question is whether the regulation of how this information is released in the right context, whether that's something that's taken care of by sort of explicit regulation, or whether that's something that's taken care of by sort of evolving social norms. And over time, I think that it kind of has to be, the regulation in some sense is just going to follow the social norm anyway. And one of the things that's awkward about the availability of this new information is that sometimes you get this lag between the existence of the database and the norm that governs how people are going to use it. So you get these sort of abuses in the gap between the invention of the new technology and the regulation by a new norm. I don't know if that's me thinking off the top of my head, but I'm never sure the extent to which the explicit regulation of who can use what data is harmful or helpful, and that's why I've remained really sort of agnostic on this issue over time.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. It's interesting you mentioned Google in particular, because I think they're one of the greatest threats to privacy out there at the moment. You know, right now, if you look at Google, they have, you know, your email. If you use Gmail, they have your calendar. If you use Google Calendar, they have everything you search for, which, if you're someone like me, is just an enormous amount of information about you. They have, you know, increasingly all these new services, like the videos you watch, your healthcare records. They're just collecting this enormous database. And so I see kind of two problems with that. One is, you know, they could kind of institutionally use it in a way that's creepy, so they use all that information to generate targeted ads and things, you know, which kind of feels weird, but, you know, it hasn't really been a serious problem right now. But also, I do kind of worry, you know, Google employs 30,000 people or something now, right? You know, if one of those happens to get in a fight with me and decide to go look up all my information in the database, you know, they would know just about everything about me. You know, even secrets that I just happen to email or IM with my girlfriend, right? Since they keep logs of every email and every IM, they would have access to all of those. And so I don't know how you stop someone from kind of going rogue and abusing that data, but it's a very real concern when it's consolidated in one big company like that.
Yeah, that's true. I've often said to my partner that, you know, like, if anybody ever finds our collection of G-chats, like from inside Gmail, I mean, it would be the most embarrassing thing in the world. You know, just partly because of the, you know, sophomoric treacly language you use with the people to whom you are, you know, closest. I don't want some rogue Google employee finding out the pet names that I have for the people I love. That's actually my greatest fear. So I guess I don't have that much to hide, but you know, some people might, and things, and this is exactly and I think there's a parallelism here, where I hope people take the parallel seriously, where when that a lot of times people who want there to be sort of greater government tracking of certain sorts of things try to dismiss the fact that a disgruntled DMV employee will use the government database to tell their buddy where his estranged wife moved to, right? But that can and does happen. But if that can and does happen, then I think the sort of thing that you're mentioning can happen as well. That a disgruntled Google employee can. I wonder, do you know anything about what kinds of safeguards Google has to keep employees from getting into the databases of information? Is it like encrypted somehow? Do you have to have special access to get into it?
Yeah, I've talked to Google employees about it, and, you know, apparently it's just not really something that's on their radar. There aren't a whole, I mean, you know, they're kind of worried about it, but there aren't real protocols, and nothing is stored encrypted, you know, and basically because they're so big and they want to make sure everything stays safe, everything gets duplicated multiple times on different servers around the world, so there, you know, there's of your G-chats, there's lots of different copies that presumably, everyone from the guy at the data center who replaces hard drives to the guy who writes G-chat code and wants to test a new feature all have access to. And, apparently, like, the idea of rogue employees is just not something that they've been particularly concerned about or tried to put any safeguards in place.
That would be really interesting. I think there's the seeds of a good mystery movie that like Al Qaeda, sends some guy to grad school so he can get a job at Google, where he starts to collect scurrilous information about people in the U.S. military through their Gmail accounts, and then blackmails them all to do their bidding or something.
Yeah. Or there's Cory Doctorow read a short story, about a guy on the run from Google, right? And they track him by where he does his web searches and, where he sends emails, and he basically has to stop using Google applications one by one because they keep using them to figure out where he is.
Oh, well, that's I guess there are darker futures though that we could imagine. I want to talk about another thing that I read on your website. You wrote a really nice article on how to be more productive, and this is like most people. I procrastinate a lot, and I wish I could do more. So, tell us a little bit about why did you decide to write something about productivity, and what did you find out?
Yeah, I mean, as someone who tries to do a lot of different things, in a short amount of time, I just naturally kind of sort of self-evaluate and see what's working and what doesn't, and try and optimize to be more productive. And so that article really came out of sort of writing up the different things I'd learned over trying it over the years. And I think the big insight that I had, which I used to start the piece, was that productivity isn't just about keeping a list of things to do and make sure you do the most important. That basically one thing a lot of people are missing is that time is not this fungible, evenly divisible chunk. Basically, you have times when you're feeling well and you can do a lot, and you have times when you're not feeling well and basically all you can do is sit and watch television. Mm-hmm. And I think like the most important first step a lot of people can take is acknowledge that and say, well, just because I'm not feeling well, I'm not going to sit and force myself to write this article. I'm going to, openly concede that and sit and watch an episode of television and get that out of my system. And, when I'm feeling better, I can make sure to actually write this article and do some more important work. And so the two big principles that I use to frame the article are, one, make sure you use the time you have as best as possible. So when you're feeling well, don't waste it on television. Make sure you keep a list of important things to do. And when you're not feeling well, keep a list of movies that you wanted to see. But also, take actual effort to think about, how well you're feeling and do things to maximize the amount of positive time you have.
Yeah, I really liked your analogy for the sort of psychology of procrastination, which was sort of two magnets that have the same polarity pushing against each other. Can you explain that metaphor? Because I thought that was great.
Yeah, I was thinking about how I feel when I'm procrastinating on something, right? And I just feel like my brain is, pushing up against this immovable force. Like, I know I have to do this thing, but I just can't make it move. And it feels like in my head, like, the same feeling you get when you push two magnets against each other and they're just repelling each other, and you just have to push really hard to make them touch.
Yeah, I've been, because of the fact that I'm such an incorrigible procrastinator. I've gotten really deeply into sort of literature on weakness of will and strategies for self-command and things like that. And even these strategies that I don't like them. Like there's this sort of new company stick that you can. You put up some amount of money, and if you fail to go through with your resolution, this money goes to charity or whatever you want, right?
Right.
And and I've even done this once when I just had to finish a paper when I was in grad school, and I told my roommate, "Here's $500," and I really couldn't afford that to lose it. That if I don't have this paper done in the morning, you have to keep this no matter what I say. And those strategies can work, but man, I hated it because I think, as you mentioned, the fact that a task is assigned, for some strange reason, makes you revolt against it. And even when you're telling yourself, I mean, I've always seen my procrastination as a sort of weird, deeply embedded anti-authoritarianism, but I resist my own authority as well. I'm like,
right.
Even I'm not going to tell me what to do. And so if I say I have to do this by tomorrow at 7 a.m., then every ounce of energy in my system gets devoted to figuring out a way of getting around that. And that's just a weird thing about. But I really like that magnet metaphor. That all of a sudden, as soon as it gets assigned, somehow the task becomes a magnet that has sort of repulsive force. That somehow every time you try to get closer to it, it pushes you away even harder.
Yeah, I've noticed the same thing, and I've thought about, like, maybe there's some evolutionary explanation, like the brain tries to avoid doing directed tasks, to make you less likely to be enslaved or something. But I've never really been able to think of something plausible, because it doesn't really seem like, during the evolutionary adaptive period, there were a bunch of people trying to enslave you and make you work at a desk on a computer writing articles for them.
Yeah.
But there's a great book on this subject called Punished by Rewards by Alfie Kohn, and he just goes over, dozens and dozens of studies where they found that basically if you try and, kids, students, adults, anyone, you try and basically give them a reward if they do the job on time or, give them some kind of punishment if they don't. All of it ends up making them do jobs less well, less frequently, lowers creativity. Basically any metric you can throw at it, it doesn't work.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the things that made me think about this productivity article was how do you use those facts? Kohn calls it the difference between extrinsic and intrinsic motivation.
Mm-hmm.
So the theory that psychologists have come up with is that if you give people extrinsic motivators, things like gold stars or rewards or cash bonuses or punishments and any of those sorts of things, what it does is it reduces your intrinsic motivation. It makes you less interested in actually doing the job, because you say to yourself, oh, I'm only doing it for the gold star, right? I don't really want to do it. And so I really wanted to explore ways to increase your productivity, not using things that would reduce your intrinsic motivation, but using things that boost your intrinsic motivation, that make you more interested in doing something and more excited about doing it.
Yeah, I think that's a completely fascinating question, because that is at the heart of so many fascinating questions about how these projects on the internet work. Why do people volunteer their effort to writing Wikipedia articles? Why do people volunteer their effort to these massive open source projects? And it also is obviously relevant to how to motivate people within firms, within schools, and I'm very suspicious of very facile interpretations of these things. But I think it's the idea that what incentivizes people is very context dependent and sensitive is profound. That you don't just get people to do things by waving a bunch of money in front of their face. But I think there's a lot of difference there's a lot of variance, I think, in individuals about what will motivate them to do things. I think I'm probably incredibly intrinsically motivated, that in the sense that if somebody tells me I'll be rewarded or punished for doing something, it makes me almost completely disinterested in doing it in the way that you mention. And the only reason I ever want to do something is because I just got a wild hair up my ass and decided this was fascinating.
Right.
And I can be incredibly productive as long as I'm doing something that piqued my interest. And that's one of the great things about the world today, with the kind of wealth and opportunity that we have, is you can actually make a living being the kind of person who doesn't take direction well. As long as you are, in fact, being productive, following your hunches and your whims. But it's an interesting question how you channel that kind of energy in a productive way inside larger projects that do have to be managed. Anyway, I don't really have any great thoughts on it, but your essay sort of brought up some of those ideas.
Yeah. Again, I'd recommend Alfie Kohn, who's done a bunch of writing about how to use these psychology experiments to improve the way schools work and the way people manage people in businesses. Because there was this fad going on for a while about bonus pay and kind of monetary rewards for getting things done, and lots of metrics, and paying people for meeting or beating the metrics. And, this is a big strain in economics, too, is that what you really want to do to make someone effective is tie the amount they get paid to the amount they contribute. And what he's found is that, in businesses, one of the more successful things is kind of creating an identification with the project. Instead of giving people this external reason to support the project, make it so that they feel like it's their project and give them the sense of ownership and control over it. And when you do that, then they feel self-motivated to really take it on and, do the best they can. They see it as something, that's their responsibility. So they really work hard, much harder in trying to make it succeed. And I think that's the same thing you see in successful web projects. Is with a site like Wikipedia, it's very easy to go and take a page, on a topic you're interested in and say, I want to make this my page. I'm going to hit the edit button and I'm going to put a lot of work into it. And I'm going to check back every week to see what other changes other people have made. And you really, you suddenly take this responsibility over it. You feel like it's your page, and so you become much more motivated to do something about it. Where in a way, if Wikipedia had called you up on the phone and paid you $20 a month to take control of the page, you probably would be a lot less excited about it.
Yeah, I agree. There's something profoundly motivating about a sense of ownership and stewardship. And I think there needs to be deeper thinking about sort of what counts as compensation. Because I think on the one extreme there's a sort of cartoonish sort of classical economics sort of idea that if you want more of some behavior, just pay more for it. Right? If the opportunity cost of doing something goes down, you'll get more of it. So offer more for doing it, and people will do more of it. That doesn't obviously work in a straightforward way. And part of the reason why is that money's not the only compensation, right? So a sense of meaning or a sense of inclusion, a sense of intrinsic achievement, all of these things can be meaningful. But on the other end of the spectrum, you can get this idea that, well, as long as we let our employees know that they're really valued team members, then we really don't have to pay them at all. But it seems like any really good project finds some way to balance. It seems like there's a lot of different sort of twigs in the bundle of overall compensation, and a good place to work is a place that balances those things well. They pay you well financially, but that's not necessarily what's motivating you to do the job. It's one of the things that helps keep you there, and it's one of the things that helps keep you happy. But the reason you really want to show up is because you care about the mission of the organization, you care about the people that you're working with and being a good team member, and so that the balancing all of the aspects of, compensation is an art that I don't think people have yet made into a science.
Yeah, I think payment in that sense really has two functions, right? One is basically enabling you to do the job. You have a salary that's comfortable to live off of, right? You can show up every day and dedicate your work to it, and you don't have to worry about making ends meet.
Yeah.
And the other part is, this kind of principle of fairness. It's one thing to get paid enough to live off of, but if you're getting paid enough to live off of and you're making millions of dollars for your boss and he's living in this super fancy mansion, even if you're doing all right, you feel like it's unjust and unfair, and it just makes you pissed off and unhappy. And I think that's the problem, this kind of new economy utopianism about how, we just, need to make everybody feel happy and a sense of ownership and control, and then we don't have to pay them anymore. That's where that part really fails on the fairness justification. Thomas Frank wrote a fantastic book called One Market Under God about all this, where he kind of goes through all this new economy boosterism about how, giving people these flexible workspaces and these, fancy self-directed opportunities means we don't actually have to pay them anymore, and, we'll just all make millions of dollars off of their hard work, and kind of skewers all of that language by saying, people actually, care about what they're paid and they care about fairness.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing, and this is the thing that I'm always trying to reinforce to people is that there's a lot of heterogeneity, that there are deep differences in individual personality, and different people prioritize sort of the different aspects of compensation differently. And one of the reasons why I like there to be a wide array of options in the labor market is because people can kind of decide whether or not they want to prioritize. For some people, they've got a big family, they've got a lot of responsibilities. What they really want from work is to maximize their paycheck because they've got to take care of a lot. And those people ought to be able to have those opportunities. And then there are other people, say like single people with no kids who are, in their 20s, who are looking for sort of creativity, are motivated by just curiosity, motivated by being part of something interesting. And it's great if there are jobs available where they can indulge that. Maybe you can give up something in terms of monetary compensation and gain things in terms of flexibility, the coolness of your workplace, and so on and so forth. So I think it's important for people to be able to customize their labor market package in a way that suits them and their circumstances well. But in order to understand why you need all this variance, it's important, I think, to understand the variance in the individuals.
Yeah, and I think, the economy right now probably has a deficit of the second kind of job, the kind of with control and flexibility and letting you indulge your curiosity for most people. I think that's one of the things that excited me about Y Combinator was it took this group of people who, is generally really interested in that, really self-directed and self-motivated and curious, these programmers basically, but who usually end up getting out of college and ending up working for Microsoft or Google or Yahoo or some big company in an office day job that doesn't really give them a lot of power once they get out of college. And Y Combinator says, well, look, here's this other opportunity where you can sacrifice some of the salary in exchange, for getting all this more flexibility and this opportunity and the chance to win big later if your company's a success.
Yeah, it sounds like a great idea. So, what's your very newest project, Aaron?
So it's a site called watchdog.net, and basically, I, like a lot of people this year, have gotten caught up in all the excitement about the election and politics, and I realized this was the time to do something I've wanted to do for a really long time, which is, start using these collaborative tools and the kind of web software that I've been building and see if you can use it to make a political difference. Mm-hmm. So the idea behind watchdog.net is kind of two parts. One is pulling together all these different data sources that are out there, campaign finance records, lobbyist records, voting records, all of these things, and kind of putting them in one place under a clear interface that everybody can understand, so you can really leap from, your local congressperson to see who contributed them and which lobbyists they hired and what bills they lobbied on and how that influenced your representative's vote and all those sorts of things. But also, not just make people depressed and apathetic about that kind of stuff, but give them an opportunity to really come together and take action. And so we're trying to build a suite of tools that are like, organizations like Move On or the ACLU have, where you can start petitions and start campaigns to write your representative or, write letters to the editor of the newspaper, things like that. But instead of having, someone in Washington, D.C. decide what the campaign should be about, we want it to be more like Petition Online, where you can go and you say, I want to start a campaign about this because I'm really interested, and start the campaign yourself and email your address book and start building movements by it, just as one average person.
Well, it sounds great. I actually meant to bring it up earlier so we could talk more about it. I'm sorry that I brought it up right here at the end of our time. But that sounds like a incredibly worthwhile endeavor. I'm looking forward to checking it out. But I think we are out of time. We're at an hour and 3 minutes. So I fear I've actually talked too much, Aaron. I meant to ask you a lot more, but I really enjoyed talking with you, and thanks for coming on.
Anytime. Thanks so much.
All right. Good luck with everything.
Thanks.